This is the sixth lecture in the series of talks about symbols. And the symbols series itself is the fourth of the series that constitute an ecology which takes the whole first year of our education, and it constitutes a cycle of integration. Integration just simply is bringing together. But in that simplicity of bringing together, you have to order the material the more that you bring it together. If you have a table full of items like this, if you want to bring them together, you might stack all the books together and then stack the bowls on top and the flowers on top. In other words, as integration proceeds, it creates its own ordering necessity. Nature is an integral ecology. Nature integrates. And the most conspicuous of all of the integrating powers of nature is gravity. So that one of the most fundamental powers in the universe, gravity, is an integral ordering which has within it a transition from a cardinal series, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to an ordinal 10, 100, 1,000. So we go from a cardinal to an ordinal ordering the more that integration proceeds, so that the techniques that are usable early on in integration have to be changed. They have to be modified. Now, usually an educational process doesn't pay attention to this basic universal fact. And yet it's one of the most fundamental of all universal principles. This change happens when the change from cardinal to ordinal. This change happens when language interiorizes. So that the powers of ordering, 10, 100, 1,000, the ordinal powers of integration, kick into play whenever language is interiorized. Now, the convenient word that we use for that quality of the process of language interiorizing is the term meaning. So whenever meaning begins to develop, we know then that an interior space, an interior world is beginning to be engendered by language. And language itself changes from a serial cardinal ordering to an ordinal stacking ordering. So that instead of language having its mythic quality, a myth is like having a beginning, a middle, and an end, a cardinal series. When you're telling a myth, when you're living in a tribal society, when you're living in a culture, language is always in a serial fashion. So that in order for people to understand each other, they must make a cardinal ordering of their images. But when language begins to interiorize, another dimension comes into play, where language no longer goes in just straight lines, but it begins to stack and have tiers to have levels of meaning. So that when language begins to have levels of meaning, the very first indication of this, the very first baby step in this, is that a single or a cardinal line of meaning begins to have two different levels of meaning for the same word. The same word sentence begins to have another meaning, and this is called allegory. Allegory. So allegory is the first indication that the integral process has matured to the point where ordinal orders of meaning begin to play in language, and it also means that concomitant with that, an inner world is developing. This happens in very small children. This change in human beings happens when they're only about 3 years old. They begin to play with what they're saying because they know that what they're saying has another possibility of meaning. So the trusting twos become the terrible threes. Because one of the first allegorical meanings that a child will have is to learn that they can say no to mama or daddy. And it doesn't mean no in a cardinal way, it means no in this newfound way. They're testing to see what you will do when they say no. So that the 2.5-year-old that very beautifully and pleasantly charmed you with questions like, how come, 500 times in a row. How come? How come the sky is blue? How come you don't know? How come mommy doesn't know? And if you get tricky and you ask them, well, how come you're asking this? They'll just say, well, how come you don't know? But when they get to be 3, already a new dimension clicks into play, and cardinal meaning shifts in its first step to having an ordinal stacking order, and the first indication of that is that language becomes allegorical. It begins to have the possibility of allegorical. And the initial allegory is in words, usually names. Usually names. In other words, there's a seed which you can recognize, and the seed is that special names will begin to have allegorical connotations, and that's the development of a new stage of integration, the development of symbols. And that is like a small pilot light. It has to be sheltered because it can be blown out very quickly. And it has to be nurtured and grown and developed. And if it is, this capacity can be added to, like another dimension, it can be added to the human being. Whereas if this particular delicate state is not handled right, instead of having a creative human being, you can create an authoritarian automaton very easily at this particular junction. Because there are no defenses within the young person. You can instill almost any kind of structure that you want to at that age. One of the great philosophers who investigated this, he's not known in this country as a philosopher, he's known as an educator, but Jean Piaget, who took a really good look at what children up to the age of 5 really do. What are they doing? And he found that up until about the age of 3, children are geniuses. They're absolute geniuses. The rate at which they learn from complete scratch whole new realms is staggering. If an adult did that, we would think they're a super mutant. But because by and large, this new capacity, this symbolic capacity, is inadvertently usually mishandled. In authoritarian states, it's on purpose mishandled. But it is so undeveloped that children, by the time they are 4 or 5, are already waiting around bored to be told what to do. Whereas children who are creatively nurtured at exactly this point, if you go into a Montessori school or something and you see the 4-year-olds, they're busy. They're busy making expressions of an inner world which is very real to them and which they want to see transpire in this world. This is the alive symbolism that we need in the human species. We need this. And in the higher forms of education, not one single step can really be taken in the higher capacities of a human being until you go all the way back and awaken that capacity in the person. You can't do a thing that's real. And so all of the higher capacities, the capacities for vision, the capacities for art, for history, for science, for civilization, none of those activities can even be essayed. That means, in English, to begin to be looked at as a practical undertaking. You can't essay any of those things until you go back and awaken this ordinal symbolic spark in enough people so that things can be done, so that creatively one can deal with the situation. Now you can see, you can appreciate perhaps, at least somewhat, that the current situation is rather a dead end. There are so few creative adults that one would run into that one begins to suspect that maybe it's a fiction. Whereas the truth is, almost everyone that you meet is secretly creative if only it could be brought out. And it doesn't take much to bring it out, which is the good news. It doesn't take much to bring it out at all. And as we talked about last week, the first requirement is a safe play space. Adults need a safe space in which to feel playful. That's the very first requirement. And in that safety is this opportunity to reintroduce the awakening, the livening of that spark that relights that pilot light, and the creative juices of someone begin to flow again. So at this particular juncture in our education, we want to do a short project which has 2 parts. We want you to make 2 things. We want you to make an amulet, and we want you to make a talisman. 2 symbolic objects. And what we'll do is during this coming week, try and make some kind of amulet for yourself, and then next week try and make some kind of talisman. So that when you come next Saturday, bring whatever you threw together as your amulet, and then 2 weeks from today, bring whatever you threw together as your talisman. Now the amulet and the talisman are the parentheses within which the symbolic field can be very short-handedly seen. It's an ancient wisdom technique. It goes back tens of thousands of years. An amulet conserves meaning. It protects meaning. It brings meaning together integrally. It holds meaning so it's not lost. And that held meaning protects you. Whereas a talisman releases meaning. It's differential in quality. It's meant to work. It's not meant to conserve, but to use. An amulet conserves meaning, builds energy protectively, whereas a talisman releases meaning and develops a resonance. So talismans resonate differentially whereas amulets can serve in an integral way. And this process is universal. It's absolutely universal. It's not something that primitive people did way back when, or that stupid people do. It's always there. An equation is an amulet. E equals mc squared is an amulet. Whereas the idea of atomic energy is a talisman. A nuclear reactor power plant, like a talisman. About 30 years ago, one of the great poets of the world, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, a Siberian, I hesitate to call him a Soviet. He never was a Soviet. He always argued with them. They always exiled him. He certainly isn't a Russian. He's a Siberian. He wrote a beautiful poem about a hydroelectric station called Bratsk Station. In Russian, Bratskaya means brotherly. And he opposed the symbol of the hydroelectric station. The Bratskaya station is on the Angara River, just outside of Irkutsk. The Angara is a huge Siberian river, and in the spring, with this tundra melting for thousands of miles, the runoff is colossal. And there's a rocky gorge area there because Lake Baikal area outside of Irkutsk also has huge old geologic granite outcroppings. And where the Angara River plunges through this gorge, they put a hydroelectric station. They thought it could never be built. It's like Hoover Dam. It was an amazing thing that they did. And when Yevtushenko realized on one of his exiles that this hydroelectric station symbolically did something, it returned light and energy and power to the people who built it. And he opposed the symbol of the hydroelectric station to the ancient Egyptian pyramid, which took all the energy and effort and finances of the people and just made an inert stone monument to somebody dead. And so in his poem, he has a dialogue between the pyramid and the hydroelectric station. The pyramid says, I love metaphysics. And the hydroelectric station says, I love men and women. I like their lives. I like to cooperate and give to them. The hydroelectric station is a talisman. The pyramid is an amulet. So they're distinctly different. Yevtushenko visited Giza across from Cairo. He went into the Great Pyramid like every tourist. Went into the chambers and he experienced the silence that's there. It's silent. It's a tomb. But when he went into the hydroelectric station on the Angara and he went down where the huge turbines are, enormous, he had a mystical experience. The turbines turning so fast that there was this eerie hum even in the rock stratigraphy of the area. He heard a word, which in English translation is everything. And it went on mystically, everything, 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 everything. And in his poem, he writes about this vision of the hydroelectric station taking the energies of the people and transforming it into a talisman of light and lighting their lives. And in doing this, it whispers all through Irkutsk and that whole area this mystical word, everything, 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 creatively, whatever you wish to do, now you can do it. So that the symbolic level is a level of tremendous transformation. The transformation from a culture which has a tribal, cardinal, series, mythic order to the beginnings of an interior world, an interior realm, a deeper human being, a deeper man, a deeper woman, where language begins to have initially an allegorical quality, the symbolic quality of language comes into play. And words, which were the names of things, change. They no longer are limited to their representational quality. They no longer mean, in reference to something else, what that is. Book, as a word, book, refers to this book. That's representational language. And on the mythic level, that's what happens. But when allegory begins to develop, the name of something, book, like William Blake's Book of Job, like the Book of Life, book begins not to have a representational meaning alone, but begins to have something which we can call a presentational meaning, which can be whatever we wish it to be. When we say life is an open book for those who know how to live, wow. We're not talking about some book over there, no matter how interesting it is. We're talking about a whole possibility, and that the possibility is enormous. So that the symbolic capacity of a human being is an opportunity. It's an opportunity that reveals itself in a very clear decision. The decision either to become numb or the decision to awaken. And so in traditional wisdom teachings, which need to be brought back into the educational everydayness, it cannot be left for genius elite in caves in the Himalaya or wherever else they're going to hide out. We can't leave this indispensable quality for just those few. It has to belong, as Jacob Bronowski said at the end of his wonderful series for BBC, The Ascent of Man. He said, if the cream of human wisdom is not in the living rooms of every family in the 21st century, it'll be in the hands of a few technological tyrants. And it'll take 1,000 years for people to get free from that one. In an ancient wisdom tradition that can be found everywhere on this planet, this capacity for symbolizing was the very first indication. It was like a portal. It was a portal of an entrance. An entrance to what? An entrance into an inner world. A whole other quality of human beings, an inner world. Now, one of the figures that we're using at this particular juncture is William Blake. We're using William Blake because his works are very germane to this symbolic awakening. And along with William Blake, we're using the great American philosopher Suzanne Langer. She's really a major thinker. And at the time she was writing Philosophy in a New Key, which is the book of hers we're using, she was as good a thinker as there was on the planet. She recognized in Philosophy in a New Key, notice the title, Philosophy in a New Key. Because on a tribal level, on a mythic level, what passes as music is usually percussion or syncopation, right? The drums, the beat. It's got to have the beat. On a tribal level, it's got to have the beat. But when music becomes symbolic, it develops a facility to be keyed to a scale. And there are many scales. The one developed in Western music is only one of many, many scales. The Chinese pentatonic scale is quite different from the octave scale that Western music developed. But the important point is, as soon as percussion develops into a symbolic scaled medium that can be keyed, then you have the possibility of developing ordinal levels of meaning, new keys. And the first new key is that music it has a symbolic allegorical quality, which was not there before. There is absolutely no allegory in Gregorian chant. Where as soon as the Gregorian chant is ordered into the symbolic form of the motet, there is a tremendous jump in capacity suddenly to make musical form do things that, frankly, 1,000 years of Gregorian chant never even dreamed of. Never even dreamed of. And that motet capacity developed so quickly that within one generation, the human genius in just one person, like Thomas Tallis, for the coronation of Elizabeth I, he knew her father, and he knew he better write a good piece of music for his daughter. I mean, Henry VIII was not somebody you futzed around with. So when Elizabeth was coronated, Thomas Tallis wrote a 40-part motet for her coronation. Now, the human ear no way can hear a motet of 40 parts. But he wrote it exactly so that if anybody could hear it, it was there. She claimed that she could hear it. She said that she was satisfied that he had done a good job. In our time, Ralph Vaughan Williams, the great English composer, took the theme from Thomas Tallis's 40-part motet, and he made a fantasia on it, which you can buy on CDs. And he took the 40 parts of Thomas Tallis and he opened them up differentially so that they led into an infinite variety of possibilities, just to show that music had made some development since the 1570s. And indeed it has. And the modern late 20th century composers are unbelievable. We've already used some of the music of Alan Hovhaness. Thomas Tallis would have been utterly speechless at some of the music orders that Hovhaness uses. Hovhaness is sort of a 21st century Mozart. Because by the time that the motet in Elizabethan times had begun to elicit in the inner world orders of feeling that were hardly even guessable before by the monks chanting Gregorian chant, the next generation after Thomas Tallis, Henry Purcell, began writing musical dramas like Dido and Aeneas that were fabulous. They were unbelievable. 1,000 years of sophisticated superior logic and meditation led to no fantastic operas. And in one generation, as soon as the pilot light of symbolic capacity in music was nurtured, even in one tiny place like London at that time, in one generation you have Tallis, the next generation Henry Purcell. It was an incredible jump. And there's only one lifetime in between Purcell and Bach. And by the time you get to Bach, music is free forever. Its capacities for symbolic expression are infinite. No way. Mass in B minor is simply a small improvement or modification of Gregorian chant. This capacity is where we are now in our education. And we need to take some care here, not to be overly serious about it, but to be attentive. When something's really important, seriousness has no place. Play is the order of intelligence. Play. A child learns to speak by jabbering in gibberish. That's the only way that the palate, the tongue, all the physiological aspects of making sounds, making the language, can be developed by gibberish. So don't be afraid of just creating gibberish at this particular point. There's no shame in creative gibberish at this point. If there's any shame, it's that you forget about it, you drop out and you go shopping. It happens. This portal, this entrance to the inner world, is so mysterious that Blake, in order to express it, towards the end of his life, when he did a huge prophetic book called Jerusalem, 100 plates. The very first plate has this huge entrance to an underground chamber, but the entrance is like a Gothic chamber, like a Gothic entrance, say, to Chartres Cathedral, with many Gothic arches in reverberating condensation, and above it is written, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Not that it's hopeless, but that what you were carrying around from your mythic days isn't going to do you any good here at all. The only thing that's going to do you any good here in the inner world is openness to explore and to find what's there. I remember one time sitting up in the Sierra Nevada. I was sitting on the very top of a mountain called Alta Peak, about 11,300 feet. And I was sitting up and I was watching this urban punk coming up on the trails. And he had a portable radio on up to his ears. This is before earphones. This is in the 1960s. He's coming up the trail. And I was waiting for him to hit the altitude thing, because the last mile or two of Alta Peak is a 45-degree angle of scree. Do you know what scree is? Crushed rock that just lays there. And you hit that, and it's like you don't go anywhere. And I saw him hit that, and it was interesting because he was on his radio station. He wasn't in the mountains. And for a while, he would just went through and finally he looked around him, and it was so surprised, and he turned around and went back. And I thought, that's interesting. The mountain has its own protective barriers. Because I remember the first time I hit that. I was in deep samadhi meditation, and I remember hitting that last mile of scree and hit that thing, and I remember kicking in this kind of hovering bird-like quality, and I was watching my shadow struggle to inch over the scree, and it took about 3 hours to get up to the top at just like, one baby step maybe per minute. It was an interesting experience just to hover over the shadow and watch it struggle, pebble by pebble, up to the top. And I remember getting to the top and looking back down and thinking this was a very interesting thing. So when I saw the radio station hit the scree and just turn around, I thought, well, yes, that's right. Reality protects itself. The profane are never going to get through. You can't learn anything about the inner world unless you're there. So if you're carrying anything from outside in, all you're going to find is the outside turned inside out. It's going to be like one of those modern surgical units where you step into some kind of bubble plastic and you go in and you're not contaminated by the inside at all. You just make a little incursion and you can go as far as the bubble plastic will allow you, but you're not really in there. You have to take the chance. You have to set all of your stuff down and go in. And if you recall, the very quality of this was there in the earliest epic myth on the planet that's in writing. The myth of Inanna, written by a woman, written by Inanna, about 4,500 years ago. She was the daughter of Sargon the Great, Sargon of Akkad. And she wrote the beautiful myth of Inanna. And in order for Inanna to go to the underworld, she had to divest herself of the 7 images. The 7 images that clothed her in her royalty. Her crown, her scepter, her ring, the various qualities that made her the Queen of Heaven. So that the only way that she could go into the interior world was to set these things down, to lose these things, so that as she penetrated into the interior world, she arrived at its center completely nude. That is to say, not in an erotic sense completely nude, but completely divested of any mark of her identity in the previous world. That when we get to the soul center of our own interior world, we are not there at all in any recognizable way. All traces of the exterior person are gone. All traces. If you find anything recognizable at the center, you didn't really get there. It's like in one of the apocryphal stories from the New Testament, hidden away and not talked about anymore. One of the apocryphal stories of St. John as an old man in Ephesus. He lived into his 90s. And he went, as the story says, he went into the home. Always homes were the place where things happened. There were no churches or anything like that. And he went into this home and he went in to wash up in the bedroom. And there was a painted portrait on the wall. And he brought the house owner in. He said, we do not have these sort of things. We don't have graven images. Or in our experience of God, we don't have graven images on the wall. And according to the apocryphal story, the man said, but Master, this is you. And St. John in his 90s had not considered himself as having this kind of a form for so long. The man led him to the wash bowl, and in the surface of the water, St. John looked in, and he saw that indeed. And then he chided the man very gently. He said, that is not me. He said, this is not me either. Let's take a break. Suzanne Langer in Philosophy in a New Key, when she is talking about this transformation, this change from a representational to a presentational form, uses a slightly modified vocabulary. She says, using a word which has become popular in later 20th century philosophy, she uses a word called discursive. So that chapter 4 of Philosophy in a New Key is entitled Discursive and Presentational Forms. Discursive and Presentational Forms. It's on page 79 of her book. And this is like the key to her book. The very first 4-line paragraph of chapter 4, Discursive and Presentational Forms, reads this way. The logical theory on which this whole study of symbols is based is essentially that which was set forth by Wittgenstein some 20 years ago. She wrote this in 1945. 20 years would be 1925. The logical theory on which this whole study of symbols is based is essentially that which was set forth by Wittgenstein some 20 years ago in his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. And we need to have just a little background here. This is the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus by Wittgenstein. Its whole thing comes to 74 pages minus the beginning. It's about 69 pages long. And it takes 2 books like this in order to come to the realization that you knew nothing about it whatsoever, even if you read it and studied it. Wittgenstein was a semi-nobility from Vienna, Austrian nobility. He was very grim, but he was extraordinarily intense. And if you can imagine, in the Cambridge University, England days of the Edwardian period, we're talking about before the First World War, he used to go around with this kind of like fatigue type jacket, and he used to ride a very early motorcycle model. I mean, he looked like a 1980s hippie dropout 70 years before. And he was the most precocious of all of the students that Cambridge University has ever had. And one of his teachers in philosophy was Bertrand Russell, Lord Bertrand Russell. And a true story is that one time Wittgenstein got so enthused at about 3 o'clock in the morning over a logical discovery. He had been reading Russell's great 3-volume tome, Principia Mathematica. I couldn't carry it, it was too heavy. I have it in the back room. And in Principia Mathematica, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead had shifted the foundations of logic forever by having shown conclusively that the forms of mathematics are identical to the optimum forms of logic, and that there were conundrums in mathematics that were obviously limitations of the method of logical thinking in the mind. And it wouldn't be for another 20 years or so until people like Frege and Gödel finally showed that indeed there are formal limits to logic by the very procedures with which the mind must work. Wittgenstein, towards the end of his life, was famous for the phrase, in German, I can't repeat it in German, but in English the translation is, whereupon a man cannot speak, therefore must he remain silent. In other words, there is a point at which intelligence must recognize that it has to shut up. Not that it doesn't know, but that with its faculty in full working order, it cannot know. Anyway, glimpsing that, Wittgenstein leapt onto his motorcycle at 3 in the morning and gunned himself over to Lord Russell's quarters, banging on the door, woke up the butler, woke up the whole staff, and Lord Russell came down in his smoking jacket, and he looked at Wittgenstein in the foyer. He had been admitted, wild-eyed, in his fatigue jacket, and before Wittgenstein could say a word, he had him thrown out, bodily, and the door slammed. We don't do things that way. This is England. This is Cambridge. I'm Lord Russell to you tonight. And so Wittgenstein told the story of the logical embarrassment of Bertrand Russell in face of another one of his teachers, G.E. Moore. And the story spread all over Cambridge and finally all over England, and now everyone in philosophy in the world knows it. That Russell one time had come into a wintry living room of G.E. Moore, another one of the world's great logicians, and Moore was sitting in front of the fireplace and had his nice little mohair blanket over his lap, and he had this basket and with apples and things, and Russell came in and he said, "Moore, I say, are those some apples in there in that basket?" And Moore, looking up, suddenly, eyes twinkling in coyness, said, "No." And Russell, being brilliant, took the cue and he said, "Moore, are there some apples in that basket?" And Moore steady-eyed, looking at him, said, "No." And finally, Russell, realizing the logical inconsistency of what he had been saying, said, "More. There are apples in that basket. May I have one?" Moore said, "Yes, you may." It's an inner joke of delicate logic. All the little prepositions, all of the little modifications are indicators which help us whenever there is a series, whenever there's a cardinal series. They become inoperative in ordinal orders. When the cardinal line stacks into powers of meaning, all of the indicators that helped us make sense out of the serial ordering of the world are inoperative. It's like a zero gravity situation. So that the mind, when the mind works in its own terms, is forced to work in terms of a referent world which is limited by gravity and by time and by space. We need to turn the tape. So that when the mind works in terms of the world, it is always compromised. It is always limited. And the image that Blake had of this is of bad adults in the world cutting off the wings of children. That the mind, the inner world, is like an inner child. I think that that's even become a saleable title. But that the inner world, which in its nascent beginning is like a child for us, has its wings clipped by the authoritarian structure of the world. Because that authoritarian structure says you can only do this and not that. You can only go in this way and not that. We know better because we've been around longer, and this is the way the world works. As long as the mind is curtailed by the limitations of the world, it is never operative in its own right. It never works the way that it really is. And so the mind, because it cannot work the way it really is, develops a capacity to improvise, to cheat, to overcompensate, and it fantasizes. And it fills in the gaps that are always there because the method of the world is so clumsy compared to the fluidity of the inner world that these post and beam structures of the outside, when they're forced on the inside, they always leave gaps and chinks and are rickety. And so the mind gets used to fantasizing to feed this kind of illusion to keep that together. This is what is meant by the term that the world is illusion. Not that nature is an illusion. Nature is not there in the first place. It's not there to be an illusion in the first place. Nature is a matrix of change. It's not statically anything at all. If you try to pin the world down, the more that you try to pin the world down, the less that it is there. Because the refined capacity to pin the world down is so acute by 1995 that we can get down to single quark and there's nothing there to pin. So that the world is an illusion doesn't refer to nature at all. It refers to the fantasizing compensation that the mind does because it's been imprisoned by limitations forced upon it by a medium that has nothing to do with it. And as Russell wrote in his book Nightmares of Famous People, that men fear thought like the plague. No one wants to really think because thought is wild. It's untamed. It goes where it is free to go. And all of the rickety structures that we have imposed upon it, all of the so-called belief systems that have been imposed upon it from without, are held in place only by illusion and fantasy. And if we come into awareness of the mind qua mind, those illusions go, because they have no basis in reality whatsoever. They have no place to be whatsoever. It's a traditional, famous experience that comes in Satori, in awakening, that not only is the illusion gone, but there's the distinct and accurate perception that it never was there in the first place. Aldous Huxley's psychotherapist in Paris was Hubert Benoit, and Benoit is famous in his book Letting Go, where he says it's an old Zen trick, that the cure of neurosis is to realize that there was no problem in the first place. So there's nothing to get adjusted to. There wasn't any problem in the first place, and that's the cure. So that realization is poignant. It's poignant. It has nothing to do with guessing. It has nothing to do with metaphysics. It has nothing to do with whatever orders this world seems to sustain. Whatever those are, they have their place, but they're only viable in that place. It doesn't mean that everything is just relative. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that nature is always in change, so that relativity is just a fact of the natural ecology, and that integration, because it is of that ilk, it's of that nature. Integration is natural. It has no there-ness there. There are no propositions that are eternal. So that the power of ordinal thought in the mind is in terms of relationalities and not in terms of things. That when the mind is seen in its own terms, there are no things there, but there are relational capacities like proportion. That's real. There are integrals like wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S. That's real. They're there. 2 + 2 = 4 any place in the cosmos. Not the 2 and not the plus, not the other 2, not the equals and not the 4, but the relationality holds. And a better way to say it is that 2 squared is a square. That a pair paired is a frame of reference. That's the old Hermetic way to talk about it. Once that's understood, then the mind begins to work in a very healthy way. It's no longer the anemic cripple which it was made into believing that it was, because it was trying to match itself up to whatever structures were enforced upon it from the outside. When it works in its own way, when it is free, it creatively plays in a realm of relationalities. And the overriding, consistent, surprising truth about relationalities is that as soon as there is a focus, any focus whatsoever, everything is focused. And about 300 years before Wittgenstein, a much more superior logician named Leibniz understood this and wrote a book on it. It's called Monadology. That the monad is not so much one, but the monad is allness, complete. That the soul is not so much one soul, is that it is the entire cosmos focused in a there. And so when two souls meet, it's like a revelation. A revelation. As someone put it in the Chinese Chan tradition one time, that when two Zen masters met, it was like two open doors facing each other. What happens in the mind when it is free, and notice that freedom is 100% the requirement for the mind to be real. Freedom is 100%. Without freedom, the mind is never real. So that in the age of revolution 200 years ago, people like Jefferson and people like Beethoven and people like Shelley, people like Blake are all saying, Goethe, they're all saying, man needs to be free to discover who he is, because he has never, except in rare individuals, ever been free, ever been himself. And we don't know what a society would look like with free men and women, because it was never seen. And so Jefferson said to Benjamin Franklin, when Franklin was on his deathbed at 84, and Jefferson went to see him to make sure that he got the transmission right from the old master. He said, we're going to see what happens when there are several million free men and women, and see what they will do. No one knows what they will do, because the world has never seen such a thing. And so when Jefferson took office, after the election of 1800, when he took office in 1801, he called in his friends and he said, we're just going to open up everything. And instead of working on the outside model of the Constitution, they worked on the inside model of the free human being. We'll worry about the others later. We'll worry about whether it matches up to the spec list later. We have to get processes and relationalities and proportions in operation so that there are men and women who are real there. Well, they're very successful. Because a generation later, those people who were born into that, even though they despised Jefferson, were Jeffersonians. They were free. One of the best examples is Thoreau. Thoreau all his life thought Jefferson was absolutely a fake, and he was absolutely a Jeffersonian free spirit. Totally. So the key is that you put wisdom into the airwaves around and not into the guru. To hell with the icons. To hell with the portraits on the wall. That doesn't do anybody any good. But if there's fresh air, good water, fertile soil, pocket full of seed, the capacity to work, let them make whatever life they're going to make. Whatever men and women are going to do, let them do it. It's a differential universe. Notice here that higher civilization is differential and not at all in the confining integral mode. Notice that human beings, the person, is not ever found in integration, but is always an expression, like a prism set in sunlight, of the spectrum of differential freedom. The spiritual person is free, not by definition, but by actual fact. And the only men and women that are going to play in the cosmos are those that are free. There's no cultural basis of integration which will allow men and women to go into space. You can't go. You can't do it. It's like the scree on the slopes of Mount Alta Peak. You don't even know that you hit a non-traction barrier. You just, to yourself, turn around and go back. You never got to the mountaintop. The only men and women that are going to play on Mars, for instance, and that's just the beginning, are men and women who are just totally free to play. Because Mother Nature, Ma Cosmos, loves her kids to be real. She doesn't want any deadheads out there mucking up things. It's a playground. It's not a parade ground. So when we come to try to understand symbols, when we come like to the 6th lecture here, what's important to us is to realize that the material that we're using now, I alluded to Suzanne Langer a little bit, now I'm going to allude to William Blake a little bit. The material that we're using is not material which is out there somewhere that we have to model our learning on. It's not that at all. It's that this material is like toys so that our play becomes more interesting. They're toys for us to play. If we use a single book because of 2,000 years of confining cultural, increasing authoritarian experience, any book used by itself now is tyrannical. It's like a methodological disease of authoritarianism and tyranny that is so embedded in the process now that using any book, no matter what it is, turns into a negative, self-limiting process. Whereas if we use a pair of books together, we key in the ordinal stacking of capacity right away, the allegorical seed of further levels of interpretation already. And we're on our way to freedom. So it seems like a very deceptively simple-minded thing to use pairs of books. Why ever would he use pairs of books? Because the longer one goes with that kind of process, the more freedom and differential power comes out. And the more that your integral ordering has more dimension to it. You can only get differential consciousness out to the proportion of the integrated ordering that you have. And so you need to take care with your integration. Not that it is exactingly correct to the model. That's the way of tyranny. But that it brings in as much richness as possible before you talismanically let it loose in terms of ideas that are put into practice. You have to put the richness of the meaning in to the integral process so that the differential consciousness has dimension to it. So that the educational process, when it really works, its first requirement is to junk the models and to go for a rich, an enriched, an enriching field of inquiry. The very first thing is to make sure that the field of inquiry is able to take in as much richness as you can put into it. So that a very good teacher in the wisdom tradition always overloads the integral process. Always gives you more richness than you can deal with. First of all, to short circuit the limited models that you came in with from previous miseducation. And second of all, to make sure that you lose track of hoping to order it later on by improved versions of those rickety old things. And third, to get you used to the fact that you're not going to drown because you know how to swim in a rich field of inquiry. You don't have to be afraid of the unknown. The unknown is an invitation to play. It's not a water that you're going to drown in. It's playtime because you know how to swim. How do we know that? If you can understand the language I'm speaking now, you have enough mental capacity to open up infinity of your personality already. If you can understand a symbolic medium like the English language to this extent, to know what I'm talking about right now, you can be infinitely free. Infinitely free. So why settle for any tyranny, no matter how buttered up it is? Who cares? Who cares if it's the finest view lot on the block? We got the whole planet. We got every planet. Let him have it. Let's go on. Let's find out. Let's go into the unknown. Remember the portal into the underworld for Blake. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Not give up. Not don't go in. But set down the old luggage because you don't need it in there. And incidentally, it's not going to work in there anyway. When the mind is awakened to itself, the first thing that it needs is to be able to get a breath of openness. Because the very first thing that happens is that the percussion, syncopation of rhythm has to accommodate in a scale the intervals between the notes. You can't have any scale. There are no such things as musical notes without the intervals in between. The intervals are, in fact, as important as the notes themselves. In fact, it's the proportion of interval and note that makes a scale possible, that makes a key credible, that makes music real. And so we have to interiorize. At the same time, we have to interiorize intervals, opennesses, articulation. And so, because this is so important, a lot of so's in the sentence, it's so important that we have to incorporate in the integral process all the time, in the whole ecology of integration, intervals, opennesses, wild spaces. We have to make sure that there are wide open wild spaces in the geography of our mind so that our spirit has places to play. We can't bring in the bad habit of paving over everything from the outside. Then you truly get an abstract tyranny, because people with paved over minds are the worst neighbors there are. Ask Poland about 56 years ago. The worst neighbors you can have are people that come in with paved over minds, because they think that you're just ready to be paved for their tanks, and they'll try to pave you. And if you say no, well, then they run over you. It's as simple as this. So that as we're getting into this, you can see that the problem application area is enormous. It takes in everything. It takes in politics, takes in history, takes in society. But instead of getting lost in the details of that, we're staying close to the center so that we can appreciate, it's like the nuclear mechanics of how this happens. And the very simplest way is to appreciate that there is a monumental change in between an amulet and a talisman, in between conserving meaning and resonating meaning out. So during this week, make an amulet for yourself. And bring it next Saturday. And then the following week, we'll all do the same thing. We'll make a talisman and bring that. And then on the third week from today, we'll have a little bit of comparison. We'll put all the amulets together on one side of this table and all the talismans on the other side of this table. And we will have a visual of about 20 different amulets and talismans. And you will be able to see instantly, your Gestalt recognizing capacities are well able to see this. You will be able to have an insight that's very rare. You will be able to see a group of amulets relationally right next door to a group of talismans. And in you will awaken this capacity to tell a difference, a basic difference, the difference between integration and differentiation. When you're in an integral mode, you want to have the world enrich your field of inquiry. And when you're in a differential mode, you want to have the inner mysterious resources of yourself enrich the world. So that the characteristic, giving, kind personality is not a function of an abstract altruistic theory, but is the actual resonant, practical reality of someone who is woken up. There's all the difference in the world between those two. Now let's look at Blake for a moment. We're going to have some slides of Blake. Last week we looked at a series of slides. They are Blake's illustrations to the book of Job. We talked about how the book of Job is one of the great works in world literature. That the book of Job focuses all of the problems, all of the requirements for realization in one work. And Blake, in illustrating the book of Job in 22 plates, the same number of plates as there are in the major arcana of the tarot deck, Blake's 22 illustrations of the tarot deck are one of the finest examples of transcendental logic in the world. Blake he styled himself as a poetic prophet. A poetic prophet. Now, when we hear the word prophet, in our civilization, in a whole range of cultures, we think of a book. We think of the Old Testament. And when we think of the Old Testament, we realize that the prophets are an order of work that usually come after a previous order of work, which is called the Torah. The best book done in our time on the prophets was done by Abraham Heschel, called The Prophets. I think there's a 2-volume paperback edition of it that's out. When we think of the archetype of a prophet, as William Blake would have, he thinks of Isaiah. And when we think of Isaiah, we think of someone long white hair, long white beard, raising the finger of fiery condemnation and speaking about apocalyptic events. But as we go deeper in our penetration, prophet also denotes for us not only the Isaiah fiery condemnation prophet, but also another kind of a prophet. We realize that Moses also then, in the Old Testament, is an image of a prophet. Quite different from Isaiah. Moses is the archetype of bringing together mythic cycle of history so that it forms a whole. And we'll come back next week and go deeper into this because there are 3 other kinds of prophet that are there in the Old Testament. And for Blake, he took them all and brought them all together and focused them all in the symbolic figure of Job, so that Job is the prism by which Blake becomes an archetype of at least 5 different kinds of prophet. But because Blake, his work, he calls himself a revolutionary poetic prophet. His work is a neo-Old Testament. Not a New Testament. And not a revision of the New Testament, but a neo-Old Testament, so that Blake's prophetic works are a parallel to the New Testament. So he's saying the New Testament didn't quite cut it, so I went back to the Old Testament and I took an allegorical line parallel to the New Testament, and that's what I'm developing. A neo-Old Testament. Not a New Testament, but a neo-Old Testament. Developing the allegory of the Old Testament. And it turns out, in terms of the wisdom traditions of this world, that that's exactly what the author of the book of Job did when it was written. The book of Job is the first book in a neo-Old Testament. And Blake was sharp enough, though he didn't know the ancient wisdom tradition well enough. Nobody knew it at that time. But Blake's illustrations to the book of Job are exactly that. They're an ordinal transformation of the Old Testament in a new Neo version. Let's set up the cameras and the slides, and we'll come to this. Okay, last week we simply looked at the series. We looked at the series as a series. We let the line of development be simply a line of development. Now we're going to take an action which traditionally is called making the jewel. It's like a jeweler who knows that the raw gem has a structure. And so the shape that was left there by accident is transformed into the gem by cutting along the lines of structure, by bringing the facets out. And the first stroke that's done in this way is to recut language so that instead of just being, quote, accidental, instead of just being as it was given to us in a linear way, in a cardinal series, we begin to make a jewel out of language. Symbolic language is a jewel of expression compared to the simple lines, the mechanical, static, dull lines of expression that were there before. The Dick and Jane run type language can only go so far, whereas a symbolic language, like a jewel, has many capacities. The first step in this is to create an allegorical sense to the structure. Last week, we simply saw the title page and then 21 Roman numeral slides in a row, so that there are 22 slides, 22 illustrations, the first not being numbered, being like a 0, and the next being Roman numerally numbered 1 through 21. So the first thing that we do is we realize that the very first numbered slide, slide Roman numeral 1, which is the next one, this is an amulet. So Roman numeral 1 is an amulet. And the last slide in the series, we're not going to get there for a while, but the last slide in the series, Roman numeral 21, is a talisman. So that in between plate 1 of Blake's Job and plate 21 of Blake's Job is the transformation from an amulet to a talisman. It's like this is such a mysterious interface that very few people have ever expressively been able to go into exactly how does this happen. Whereas Blake was so refined, spiritually very refined, he was able to see, because if you take Roman numeral 1 as the beginning and Roman numeral 21 as the end, there are 19 phases in between, and Blake gets them, gets every one of them. But the 19 arrange themselves in 2 orders. Because when you're counting here, every 10 becomes a new order. 1, 10, 100 by adding a 0. But Blake here is playing at a very interesting kind of cross situation. We'll get into it deeper next week. What we want to understand here now is that if we take plate 1 as the amulet and plate 21 as the talisman, then we have a series, 2 different orders. Roman numeral 2 begins the first one, and the end of that series is Roman numeral 12. 1, 1, with the lines over it for Roman numeral 2, and X11 with the lines over it for Roman numeral 12. So that from plate 2 to 12 is a series which develops itself in a kind of a natural way. Whereas plate 13, Roman numeral X111, plate 13 begins an allegorical restatement of that series and runs all the way to plate 20. So that there are going to be two different levels. Level 1 is a series from Roman numeral 2 to Roman numeral 12. Then level 2, the allegorical realm, is going to be Roman numeral 13 to Roman numeral 20. Now, to save a little bit of time here, the very center of the first level series is going to be plate Roman numeral 7, VII. So plate 7. So when we get here, we're going to look at this series now. When we get to 7, note what 7 is. And on the second level, on the second series, the allegorical series, the middle is going to be two plates. It's going to be plate 16 and plate 17, XVI and XVII, 16 and 17. So that the very fulcrum of the first series of meaning, the natural meaning that would be there from the outside, from the culture, from the tribal understanding, from the man interpretive level, is plate 7. Whereas the second series, which is not man's interpretation, but God's revelation, a whole different kind of meaning, an inner meaning, plates 16 and 17 are the fulcrum. So that the symbolic difference in allegory is the difference of the meaning of plate 7 from plate 16 and 17. So let's just look at the series again. And let's keep our eyes open because we're symbolically keyed now to understand that the difference between plate 7 and plate 16 and 17 together is the symbolic fulcrum upon which the whole work pivots. And there's a lot more that we can know, and we will know. But this is the first act of taking the raw and making the initial cut to make a symbolic structure. Okay, here's plate number 1, Roman numeral 1. Here's the amulet that holds the meaning. Okay, now Roman numeral 2, next slide. This is the beginning of the first series. Here's the Satan presenting himself, Yom Yahweh, the day of the Lord, and everybody presents himself, and he comes in, and God says, right away, where do you come from? Not that he doesn't know, but this is the only response to the Satan. Notice the Satan is a neuter figure, neither man nor woman, but neuter, the Satan. And the Satan always replies from roving to and fro on the earth. He doesn't come from anywhere. He just comes from this kind of water bug activity in the world. He says, well, that's where I come from. And God immediately says, you must then know the prize person on earth in that whole medium, who is Job. And the Satan says, yeah, he's nothing real. He's just paper thin. You push him and he'll crack. He doesn't quite say that. This is a Chicago version of the story. Next slide. Is this 3? Okay. So God says, you have him in your power, but you may not kill him. And so the Satan does his number here. Kills his children, kills his flocks, causes havoc, and Job is left, bereft, alone. Next slide, please. So this is 4. And as he's lamenting, figures come running, messenger after messenger saying, it's worse, this is gone, it's worse, that's gone. And Job is lamenting. Next slide, which is Roman numeral 5. again. Notice that there are two repetitions. The Satan comes again, the same kind of conversation, but a deeper, remember we talked about symbolic augurs, a deeper thing. The Satan says the reason he didn't cave in is that you took his stuff away, but you didn't hurt him. Let's get him. And God says, anything, but don't kill him. So the Satan pours boils. Here's slide 7. 6. And then 7 is the next one, which is the fulcrum of the first series. Let's look at 7. Next slide. This is the moment of triumph. The moment of triumph for the Satan. Because what has happened here in plate 7 is that in all of this, Job's comforters come in plate 7. Traditionally called Job's comforters. The comforters are not so much comforters. I mean, they're going to sit there and commiserate with him, and then they're going to say to him in this kind of human interpretive way, what did you do? God is not capricious. You must have done something pretty bad. What was it? And he keeps saying, I have done nothing. And they say, well, that's the worst crime of all, right? Pride? You thought you did nothing? You deserve everything you got. Because human interpretation is always looking for the identity of the punishment with the crime. You must have done something because you're being punished. It's the serial ordering upon which the world works in mythic terms. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The lex talionis. You will not be punished for nothing. Whereas Job suddenly realizes in a deepening way that in fact that's what's happened. He has been punished for nothing. And so he asks not to stay in the series, not to stay in this cardinal ordering, but to be given a higher power of seeing. He says, if I cannot know, at least there should be some kind of umpire between God and man who can decide what's just. Next slide. Is this number 8? Then next slide is 9. The next one is 10. Next is 11. And the next one is 12. And by the end of the series, they're all out of arguments. They're all out of interpretations. They're convinced that he's guilty, and he's convinced that this whole level is exhausted of meaning and has not produced the insight that is called for. So that the next slide is the beginning of a second series, not of man's interpretation, but of God's revelation. Next slide. And there it is. God coming out of the whirlwind. It's not an interpretation. It has nothing to do with interpretation. It has nothing to do with adjusting you to the conditions out there. It has everything to do with the beginning of a cure. A cure. Cure is like permanent. The adjustment lasts only so long as the mail is delivered. Next slide, 14. God's revelation. 15. More revelation. Now we come to the two slides that are the key, because they are the fulcrum of the second series of God's revelation. 16. And when you come to 16, the traditional title given here is The Fall of Satan. And number 17, the traditional title is The Vision of God. So the fulcrum of the first series is man's interpretation through so-called, quote, comforters. Well, they're not comforters at all. It's an allegory that one has to see. They're not comforters. They're allegorically comforters, and that there's no resolution on the level of allegorical, quote, comforters. That the condition of life is such that the suffering we go through cannot be answered by, quote, comforters, but it can be made known when we go to the level of the fall of Satan and the vision of God. So that now, next slide please, now Job begins to get it. He doesn't get it in terms of interpretation. Next slide, 20. 19. Next slide, 20. So on slide 20, at the end of the second series that began with God in a whirlwind, there's God in a whirlwind up at the top. And it is now the central fulcrum of the tableau, which is behind, and Job now is able to be the voice out of the whirlwind, telling his three daughters the three graces of wisdom, the whole story. So that when we come to slide 21, Roman numeral 21 in focus, here is the talisman, that the whole meaning of what we have gone through is now released. Where do you go from this? You take this and go into your own lives in the world. More next week. Please bring your amulets.